Sam Seder. The Majority Report, Emma Vigeland is off today. I want to welcome back to the program Alex Press, contributing, or I should say staff writer at Jacobin on all things labor and more, maybe? I don't know. Yes. Thanks so much for joining us. You did a retrospective of 2023 in terms of labor actions and the U.S. working class. Give us, in a nutshell, summarize for us, like where was 2023 in the context of maybe the past 50 years, but also the past, like, say, decade?
Sure. So the easy to remember number about 2023 is that just over 500,000 workers went on strike in the United States. That was double the number that went on strike in 2022, which itself was double what 2021 saw. So in that sense, that one's an easy trend to keep track of there. You weren't just crazy. It's true that workers were striking at like crazy numbers, right? I mean, the biggest strikes here, of course, the UAW stand-up strike, the Hollywood strikes by the actors and the writers, the near strike by the Teamsters at UPS. We can go into some of this stuff, but there were strikes everywhere, especially in the private sector. And that's the other key takeaway, is that in the United States, unionization is really low. We know this. It's about 10% right now. That masks the fact that in the public sector, about 1 in 3 workers are in a union. In the private sector, it's 6% total. So when you have all these strikes in the private sector, it shows something is really going on. This is not the power center of American labor, and yet that's where workers are striking. As far as the longer view of things, we saw a big uptick. We saw those teacher strikes in the public sector just before the pandemic. That was pretty significant. But going back several years before that, we haven't seen kind of the mass strikes and the mass near strikes that we saw this past year. I've been describing it kind of loosely as a way to convey to people that it feels like things are adding up to more than the sum of their parts, right? The unionization rate's still low. We can get into the problems with labor law and stuff, but you're starting to see that like workers are pent up, they're mad. They went through the pandemic in ways that we can discuss, really, I think, clarified the lines of who's in charge in the workplace and who has to take on risk for that person in charge. And that's what's leading to all of this organizing. The one other number I give as far as full perspective, early 20th century stuff, is right after World War II, we saw something like 1 in 10 workers go on strike. We're talking about millions and millions of workers. That was, the years of World War II where they had pledged not to strike. Problems were just festering, and it exploded in World War II. And I think the comparison to the present is not in the same numbers. We don't have millions of people striking, but we do have this shared experience collectively as a country of how COVID hit. That is not exactly the same as what World War II the experience was like if you were in the US, but is this very extreme rewiring of your sense of what the world is, how it works, and what you're going to put up with. I think the analogy does have some accuracy to how people are feeling now.
All right, so I have 2 questions to follow up on that. The first being that, and I think it was in 1945 or 1946, somewhere around there was something like, I don't know, 5 million. You said the number in the context of number of workers, but it was something like 5 million people, and I guess our population at that time was probably closer to 120, 140 million people or something. It was probably half of what it is today.
Right.
So we're talking about really 5% of that number relative to that time. But labor laws have changed, and like you say, our union density is down. So 2 questions. One, and they're a little bit disparate, but one, how much of that knock-on effect could you see coming out of World War II as a prediction as to whether this will carry through? And then sort of a related question is, how much of this is, I think COVID, you're right, was without a doubt an accelerant and an acute impetus for this. But also, it seems to me that really, like, starting in 2011 with that Chicago teachers strike, and then through the Red State Rebellion that took place, I guess it was 2015, maybe it was 2016, like around there. And just generationally speaking, following Occupy, there feels like there is a greater consciousness that COVID didn't take advantage of, but that was pre-existing to COVID. And so I wonder, like, where you see how much of a trajectory you think we're on at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that is the longer story I tell, basically, Sam, is that CTU serves as this kind of pole of what would a left-wing, kind of socially progressive, community-conscious union look like. When you go into all of these newer strikes or new organizing campaigns, you often end up encountering CTU. Like, someone will tell you they learned from a CTU person, or they were at a labor notes conference with some CTU members. So I think that's totally right to include them in the story. And then, the shorter term story I tell is, Occupy, as much as we is sort of publicly just derided as having accomplished nothing, it really introduced the language and the consciousness of inequality it back into a country where class politics and class language were largely lost. The idea that, like, politics and inequality is something you can go out and talk about and have a role in changing, rather than something you kind of watch on TV when Barack Obama speaks or something. That was key. I was a part of that movement, of course. So
a lot of organizers, I think, like today, were either first or second generation from Occupy. It seems to me.
Right. So the story I tell, I'll try to keep it short-ish, but then you go through and you have two other strands that I think are important. One being the Bernie Sanders campaigns of 2016 and 2020. I can't tell you how often I'm talking to someone who just organized a new union or is part of a strike, and they'll tell me, if I start asking about, why are you doing this? The odds are against you. Why bother with this? They'll say, well, I was a big Sanders supporter in 2016, and he said that, unions are kind of the engine for all the other transformations we want in society, and that working class people are the most important people in the country. And, they'll say, I took those lessons to heart. So when those Sanders campaigns wound down, it's not like people just went into despair and became apolitical again, especially the young supporters. Many of them went and took jobs at Amazon and started trying to organize, or they became union staffers and decided to devote themselves to strengthening workers' power. This is a real through line. And then the third strand that operates, I think, in a similar fashion is the endless kind of uprisings against police brutality in the U.S., especially 2020, that summer. A lot of people, that was their first time getting brought into a movement demanding change in a huge sector of the economy, saying that the violence of the state is not acceptable. It's not like you kind of wind those opinions back in when you clock into work. All of a sudden, when you have a racist manager at your job, you're going to take the experiences you had in the movement and say, this is not okay. And that often ends up being the sort of opening story for a new union campaign. If you start talking to the workers, eventually you'll get back to, there was a discriminatory boss, or I had this, manager who did X, Y, and Z. So these things, I think, really are kind of building on each other. And as for where it goes, I don't know. But given that kind of years-long lineage, it's not like it disappears when COVID kind of tamps down in the country.
Well, let's also talk about the sort of also concurrent and maybe not necessarily coincidental. I mean, you mentioned Bernie Sanders, but in terms of like the 2020 primary, one of the impacts that we can see is, in areas of antitrust, I think that has like largely been sort of like Elizabeth Warren's sort of people on some level, but within the context of labor. Certainly there's been influence from Bernie Sanders in this, and the National Labor Relations Board has been probably the most friendly to labor in decades. It seems like put into context for us, and maybe they didn't all happen in 2023, but the changes that have been implemented by the National Labor Relations Board in terms of like organizing on the premises of the workplace. And now the SEMX ruling, which, is in my estimation, sort of like almost like card check lite. And then what is needed to sort of like close the loop, if you will, on empowering the unions once they're unionized.
Right. So just for the audience, so the SEMX decision is a very recent ruling by the National Labor Relations Board, which says that if an employer commits an unfair labor practice, so violates some labor law, to the degree and seriousness that it would necessitate just scrapping a union election and holding another one. So if an employer does something that so messes up the election that you have to rerun it, now under SEMX, the employer just automatically is required to recognize the union instead. So that is card check lite.
Well, and also the first part of it is that they don't necessarily, the people who want to unionize, the workers who want to unionize, don't necessarily have to have a vote. They can sign the card, and if there is over 50%, the employer has 2 weeks to respond and have a legitimate argument as to why they shouldn't be unionizing.
Yes. And then as far as the other things, Sam, that you mentioned, being allowed to organize on the premises, this is a really remarkable thing, right? Things that we just accept as normal in the United States, in the labor world, that, it almost is comical the ways that workers and their union representatives, when they're organizing a new campaign, have to try to, with sneaky tactics and at night and off the clock, steal lists of workers. They're not allowed on the premises. It's really bizarre, right? Because the employer, of course, has constant access to the workforce. So this is one of the ways that union organizing in the US is not a level playing field. And so, you mentioned being able to organize on the premises, and this was a key intervention of the NLRB during the Amazon campaign at JFK 8 in Staten Island, which is still the only facility in the United States that has formally won an NLRB election at an Amazon facility. And so that was key because it meant that the organizers involved, all of whom were Amazon workers anyway, would not be chased off the premises when they were talking to a worker after their shift or during a break. It gave a little more room to breathe. And there are a few more interventions that Abruzzo, who's the head of the NLRB under Biden, has been making, sort of aggressively finding in favor of workers who've been fired illegally in the NLRB's ruling, especially at Starbucks. So demanding employers rehire workers who were fired. The one thing I would say here, well, I guess two things. One is that workers certainly are going to try to make use of these rulings. I was talking to an Amazon or to a UPS worker who's a Teamster, and the Teamsters are working hard to start building ties with the Amazon workers all across the country. This is one of their big kind of pledges, is to help organize Amazon. And he said, we think the SEMX ruling is really important. We're going to use that. We all have we've memorized its ins and outs, all of us working on these Amazon campaigns, and we're going to make use of it and run with it. Now, on the flip side, the NLRB, no matter how good the person at the top of it is, really is like a little, it's like a little dog yapping at a giant human being that is, the body of Amazon or Starbucks. The monetary penalties the board can impose upon $1 billion company are like pennies, right? Even when a worker dies, and there's a finding from OSHA that the company was negligent, that's usually just a couple $1,000s. So imagine what it is for an employer that simply fires a worker rather than kills them. This is, I think, I bring this up not to demoralize people or bum people out, but because the other piece here is that workers have to feel and figure out a way to actually be able to, in practice, enforce their rights. So the workers you can't wait on the NLRB to tell Amazon to bargain with you for a contract, which Amazon is refusing to do with the JFK 8 union. They haven't even admitted that they recognize the validity of the union, much less bargained with it. You have to find a way to force them to, right? You cannot wait on the NLRB. And, as we know, the NLRB may look very different come the end of this year, with the presidential election, which is a huge setback, but also why you can't put all your eggs in that basket. And so I think workers right now, part of kind of it's not a manic rush, but a sort of frenzy to win new unions, to lock in gains, to make as much progress as you can right now, is this sense that we're not going to have this environment forever. This environment being both the friendly NLRB, but also the tight labor market, which really has been crucial, which started during the pandemic when, famously employers said, we can't find anyone to work here. Obviously that makes it easier for workers to demand more if the employer is more reliant on them. The labor market has loosened up a little bit since the heights of that, but it's still really historically low. It's, the unemployment rate right now is something like 3.4, 3.5%. And you hear that, if not in those words, all the time. You hear workers say, I can find another job if need be. You know, I'm not afraid of getting fired. I know I can find something else that pays me as poorly as this job. What? I'm too afraid to lose it. That's a paraphrase of almost an exact quote from the first organizing director for the Trader Joe's United Union, another union that kind of is on the march this year. So that those factors, I think everyone is keeping in mind, are time limited, and we don't know how long we being the entire working class in the U.S. have to kind of seize the moment. So that's my analysis of how it's going and whether it's getting in for the long haul.
We should say that folks can go back. I think it was in the summer of 2022. We interviewed Jamie Edwards, who's one of those folks from Trader Joe's up in Hadley, Mass.
Yep.
But all right, so one more question about the National Labor Relations Board, and then more broadly, for them, because in particular, particularly because they have limited enforcement power. Mm-hmm. It seems like the big thing that needs to happen now in terms of Abruzzo as the general counsel, that they need to get to a place where they can say, once unionization happens, if a contract isn't offered within a certain period of time, we go to arbitration or we go to mediation or we impose one. That seems to me to be the really sort of like most important next step, so that Amazon can't do what it's doing, Starbucks can't do what it's doing, because it has been made a little bit easier and there's more of an impetus to unionize. But now, like, the plan by management is, let's make people demoralized about the value of that union by not giving them a contract. What's your sense of the chance of that happening? And then just give us a sense of what you think you were going to see in 2024.
The chance of what exactly happening?
Well, of some type of measure where they take the next step, where they say, if a contract is not offered within 365 days, that is prima facie a unfair labor practice, and therefore we move into immediately mediation or arbitration or whatever it is, and impose a contract.
Right. I think that's totally possible. And it's funny that, I'm working on a labor history podcast with some various academics, historians, organizers. And we were just covering 1934, when there were 3 general strikes in the United States. And, arbitration was a big part of this. Mediation was a big part of resolving those strikes. You had FDR had just passed, the NRA, that's empowering with Section 7 workers to have the right to organize, to collectively bargain. And yet what it looked like was you had employers who said, we object to the entire idea of unions. We're not going to sit down with them. And then you had workers who said, okay, well, what do you want us to do then? There's nothing we can agree to if they won't fundamentally recognize the unions. And so then you saw this conflict shifted onto arbitration and mediation, and lots of panicked sweat by those who were mediating as they tried to find a way to please these employers who really were the holdouts. And it's hard for me not to think of that coming up once again as the idea, if were the NLRB or some other legislative reform to kind of be pushed forward that said, if you don't have a contract within a year, that is evidence of an employer bargaining in bad faith, on its face with nothing else added. I imagine that would Amazon then, you have a mediator come in, you have anybody come in? I mean, it doesn't seem like anyone can force this unless workers say either we're striking until we get a contract, or otherwise, kind of forcing the employer's hand. Because these companies are willing to just take these hits, both reputationally and legally. There's
something about knowing, though, that you're explicitly on the right side of the ruling or the law to empower that organizing, I think, in my sense. But
that's true.
All right, so what do you think we're going to see in 2024? Like, in terms of are you aware of broad union strategies that you can tell us about, or what?
Yeah, sure. I know that the UAW is serving as kind of a pressure on a lot of other unions, where I think a lot of members and staffers are saying, look at what they're doing. We should be more like that. And what they're doing is, one, starting to expend more money, more time on new organizing. You know, they won this stand-up strike at the big three, and within days they go public with the claim and the aim to organize basically the entire non-union auto sector, which is now larger than the union auto sector. The majority of auto workers in this country are not members of any union, including the UAW. So they've already, you know, had public campaigns starting, especially in the South. You know, the Chattanooga Volkswagen giant plant, now workers are signing cards there to join. So I think that kind of aggressive model that is also a part of this kind of democratization of the UAW, where you have a new rank and file reform caucus, UAWD, you have a leadership that is clearly very responsive to its members, and rather than stymieing them or shutting them up as previous UAW leadership did. And so I think what we're going to see is a question of, are other unions going to take up these kind of internal reforms and this external aggression in organizing new sectors and also being less conciliatory with the employers? So you might see more confrontation. You know, Shawn O'Brien also has been this way with UPS. That might be something that catches on, you know, an end to shaking hands with your employer as you are forced to, you know, sort of cut your own members' pensions and pay. The other kind of like main things people should keep in mind are Hollywood may once again see a really big strike this year. You know, IATSE, which is the grips and electricians, you know, all the quote unquote below the line workers on a film set. They are up for, their contract is going to expire in July, and they nearly struck the last time, which was really remarkable. IATSE is not a strike prone union.
Right.
These workers, just to keep it short, their schedules are unbelievable. You know, they get in car crashes trying to drive home after a 24-hour shoot or 16-hour
No, it's ridiculous.
day.
And also, they don't have the margins that, let's say, a lot of the actors do. They haven't set up, on one hand, they don't have the margins that the more successful actors do. And on the other hand, they don't have the second jobs that actors who, you know, have day jobs have. And so they're in many instances a lot more perilous. Well, Alex Press is fascinating, but we got to go. We will put a link to your retrospective of 2023 in our podcast and YouTube description. Alex Press, if folks have not been regularly reading you in Jacobin magazine, they're making a mistake. They should be doing that. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Sam.